Welcome to Market Meditations, the podcast where Chris Haydel and Neal Mody, myself, do a deep dive into how to be a better human. And hopefully that also makes us a better investor as well. By day, Chris Haydel is a registered investment advisor and investor in the public markets extraordinaire. And by day, Neal Mody is a venture capitalist. I don't normally talk about myself from a third-party point of view, but I'm a VC investing in life science companies.
All opinions expressed by Neal Mody, Chris Haydel, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Zoic Capital or Haydel Beal and Associates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
The big time stuff that I wish I had. The big time stuff that'll make you mad. The big time stuff. I like the big time stuff. I like the big time stuff that I never had.
We're welcoming Franklyn Prendergast to the podcast today. He's a PhD MD. More notably, he helped run the Mayo Clinic as one of the board members and actually ran the cancer clinic and made it one of the top cancer clinics in the entire country. In addition to that, he also served on the board of Eli Lilly. And previously to that, he chaired the board of the Infectious Disease Research Institute in my hometown, Seattle, Washington. Frank is a Rhodes Scholar in addition to that. I guess I could go on about Frank's resume forever.
There's never
so we
enough.
should probably just
There's
learn
never
Frank.
enough, Frank.
There's never enough. But I guess the most important thing is I call Frank my close friend, and I learn a lot from him nearly every time I talk to him. Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Neal.
Yeah, welcome, Frank.
And Chris, I thought we had spoken before, but I feel as though I know you. Neal has spoken extensively about
Oh,
you.
well, thank you. I guess I have to defend myself at some point.
Yes, you will.
Maybe some is indefensible, but welcome. It's great to So, Frank, you caught the disease. You got the virus.
Yes, I did. It was in many ways it was a surreal experience. I had been traveling in New York just about the 5th of March. Got back. My birthday was the 7th. We had a celebration on the 6th. And we don't really know where it started, but we suspect it was when we had a birthday celebration with the whole family, because of the 6 people who were there, 5 got sick with COVID.
Were you skiing in Italy, or was this just a New York trip?
No, there's no skiing. Yes, there's no skiing in Jamaica, so I never learned. So this was interesting and disastrous in many ways. It's interesting to tell the story because there are so many myths, and with all these broadcasts recently of the so-called, well, I call them quasi-town hall meetings with the president and his team. Apart from Fauci and Birx, there have been so many misleading statements. I think the public is justified in being completely confused. But my own journey began very simply with a very low-grade fever, 100.8. As a physician, I wouldn't really look very hard at that particular temperature. But it quickly degenerated with a very dry, hacking, miserable cough, shortness of breath, and then progressively, many of the other symptoms you've heard described. Took about 8 days to fully develop, at which point I got very weak, very easily fatigued, miserable cough, low-grade temperature, and most significantly for me, loss of taste and a diminished smell. The medical terms for those are dysgeusia and hyposmia. And the reason I mention those names is it's worth remembering that the total loss of taste is called ageusia. This was an altered taste. I didn't completely lose my sense of taste, but everything I tasted wrong compared to what it should have. I didn't eat for 9 days, and I lost 10 pounds. Very early on, about the seventh day, it started, and the eighth day, I remember I stopped eating for 10 days, for 9 days. 100.8. 100.8, never got above 100.8, and that was with a 100.8, not 108, 100.8. 108, I would have croaked. Uh, and um, the diminution of symptoms was slow. Took about 12 days, so the total course was about 21 days. Um, the taste took a little longer to recover, but the weakness, and it really was weak and short of breath. Uh, I got to the point where I couldn't walk more than 200 yards on the level ground, at least here in Colorado. Um, and the public health nurse called me. I couldn't get tested, by the way. There were no tests available, despite all the hoopla you hear from the White House. I could not get tested because I wasn't sick enough. But if I've gotten more sick, just judging as a clinician, I would have died. I couldn't go to the hospital because the emergency room wouldn't take me in any of the hospitals close to my home. So basically, it was a matter of toughing it out. And since I live alone, that was quite an experience. I can only imagine the despair that patients who are by themselves in the hospital on a respirator must feel. It would be nice to have the White House express some empathy for those people because it's horrible. The public health nurse, after I recovered, I had an antibody test, one of the early ones. Um, I don't know if it's fully approved yet, but it was a very strong positive, which, as a former laboratory person myself, I don't think this could have been a false positive. It was too strong. And I was called by the county public health board to give them my experience because of the report of my positive test. And she asked me, what is the single worst symptom of all? And I said, my 4-year-old child would have said, I felt yucky. And that's a superb medical description.
We appreciate that.
So that's my COVID experience. And I'll tell you, I feel for the patients who get really, really sick. Because in my erstwhile days as a clinician, as a medical student, intern, and resident, everybody thinks, well, they hear about ventilators, they have ventilators. It is a miserable experience to be on a ventilator. And then you have the challenge of getting off the ventilator, which can also be a very miserable experience as well. So I count myself as having been very, very lucky. I had 3 strikes against me: diabetes, hypertension, and age. And any one of those could have knocked me off
How
with this
did you
stuff.
treat yourself while you were sick and in quarantine, doctor? What would you recommend, or what course did you take?
Well, what they say, what physicians tell you, usually is true. Um, uh, Forgive me, just ignore that if you can. Um,
We can. We're good at it. We're good at putting noise out of our minds, as
well,
good
there's
investors.
a hell of a lot of chicken soup, a lot of lemonade. Keep myself very well hydrated. Keep my lungs as clean as you can. There's one other symptom in with regard to hydration. I noticed for about 10 days I was accumulating fluid in my abdomen. I could tell just because I would percuss my abdomen that I have something to do. And you would hear the dullness. And I also noticed that urine was exceedingly concentrated despite copious intake of fluids. And then about day 11 or 12, I just had this massive diuresis for about 24 to 30 hours. Thereafter, my stomach became flat, the fluid was gone, and I could just have a complete normal micturition. I think some of these symptoms are played light off. And one other thing I'll tell you, which is very important in terms of taking care of yourself. Recently, I had a cause to wear an electronic monitor, like a Holter monitor, and my heart started doing some flippy flops and arrhythmias that I don't think I could recount exactly why. The diagnosis from the monitor was essentially what is called a paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. So I was getting arrhythmias. And the reason I mention that is um, it didn't surprise me knowing what I know about how this virus is supposed to infect the body. But much too little is made of that problem because I'm convinced that many of the patients who are dying, especially the younger ones, may be dying from arrhythmias. So that's my COVID story. I've become a COVID celebrity. With
It's the wrong kind of celebrity to be, Frank.
well, let me tell you, I really don't wish on either of you this condition. I've had flu in the past. I've had dengue in the past. This is by far the worst viral infection I've gone through.
And
Frank,
that
go
was
ahead.
a miserable 3 weeks, Frank. And how are you now? Do you feel that there were?
Oh, I'm fully recovered. My strength hasn't recovered. I notice that when I'm riding a bike. That's not surprising. And I did lose a lot of weight, but I've been eating copiously and I've regained much of it. Um, and the feeling of just being sick, it's worse than malaise. That has gone completely. But it took me about 4 to 5 weeks in total to fully recover.
Frank, you and I were having a conversation about something that could be even worse than the current pandemic, that I haven't heard anybody else talking about anywhere. We were talking about H1N5 and the
H5N1.
H5N1 and
Yes.
the coronavirus mutating. Do you mind sharing the bleakness of that conversation with our listeners, please?
Well, I've been interested in infectious disease since medical school, and one of the reasons is that I early on had learned about the so-called Spanish flu, which, by the way, is not called Spanish flu because it originated in Spain. In fact, Spain was largely excluded from most of the pandemic. But the Spanish flu was H1N1. It was a species. The H5N1 is so-called bird flu. And the point about H5N1 is the increased infectivity, and second, the increased severity of disease. And that is incubating. And the public health people around the world are fully aware of it. It's incubating. And we don't know when it might launch as a pandemic. This is not the last pandemic. That's the first thing. The second thing is coronaviruses are ubiquitous. There are coronaviruses everywhere. And we've had two major warnings about coronaviruses before. The first was SARS. That was just called SARS-CoV. That's the name of the virus. The second was MERS. And I happened to be in Saudi Arabia at the time when the MERS epidemic was raging. And given the symptoms that I heard about directly from people in the health service in Riyadh, I was quaking in my shoes, wondering whether I would get it or whether it would get loose in the country, because the lethality of especially of MERS is greater than that of coronavirus. If we can guess at what either of those is really in terms of lethality. The point of all of this is at any moment you could get an escape variant, and those could launch as pandemics. I think it's a little harder for them because they're not quite as contagious, I don't think, as coronavirus. One of the things that strikes me about the proper name for the virus is SARS-CoV-2. The thing that strikes me as a physician and as a scientist about SARS-CoV-2 is how remarkably contagious it is. And if you want to get an idea, you should read the report from the German epidemiologist who just released a report on patient zero in Germany. And if their story is right, then everybody should be really scared about how easy it is to catch this
That's the
condition.
salt shaker story.
That's correct. You, Chris, you got it right. Pass the salt shaker. If that story is more than simply anecdotal, that is really frightening. So the net of all of this, Neal, is that given the ubiquity of coronaviruses, And given the fact that it has already mutated into forms like MERS and SARS-CoV-1 and then SARS-CoV-2, there needs to be preparedness for this, mechanical in terms of PPE, etc. You heard the story, which is a shocking indictment, by the way, of the administration. And secondly, the preparedness scientifically. Neal, you may not know this, but IDRI with Steve Reed started a program a few years ago called Rapid Response Vaccine Development.
I'm familiar. Yeah.
And the notion being that you can prepare. For example, since the spike protein is so popularly the target for vaccine development, why not have expressed it and developed a vaccine as a preparatory step, irrespective of whether you use it, and develop it to the point where the launching of a vaccine through appropriate phase 3 studies would be feasible. But human beings are not known necessarily for their intelligence. And it really is a shocking indictment of the entire public health system. One, that warnings duly given are not taken. Number two, that we refuse to spend the relatively small amount of dollars that it would take to keep seed stock for a potential vaccine, even if we keep it just in the freezer, and then be able to put it out in a moment's notice and launch both a phase 1 and a phase 2 study to look at effectiveness and safety.
We actually had a conversation with an economist last week named Josh Gans out of University of Toronto, and he was suggesting that he's not sure that the world governing bodies are going to do anything quickly about this pandemic together, which we all obviously think was ridiculous. And he pointed out that it took 2 world wars to get the IMF started. So I wonder what it takes to get the equivalent for pandemic readiness worldwide.
Well, and it's also true that's our bias, right? The recency bias. So something may come of it, but will we sustain it?
Well, that's the problem. There is no sense of prophylaxis, at least in this regard. Socially, yes, but not in this. And yet it is feasible. It is absolutely feasible. Just like you keep seed stocks in the Arctic, you can darn well build at least the early stages of vaccine development, at least through the point of proof. And I have proof of the validity of what I'm saying, because the Ebola situation is a case in point. IDRI is part of a contract to prepare a vaccine funded by the government. This is a wonderful case of preparedness. They have a contract for $30 million to prepare a vaccine, which will be a pentavalent vaccine against all the dangerous hemorrhagic fevers. And we've talked about coronaviruses. You really want to hear something nasty? Talk about Ebola Zaire and Ebola Sudan, and then Lassa and Marburg. And those have not been at least let loose on the world, fortunately. But Zika was, and Nipah is also a significant risk. Fortunately, they haven't been let loose. But there is a vaccine that's being prepared as we speak against these hemorrhagic fevers, thank the Lord. And by the way, the initial results are spectacular. So some work is going on if it could be broadened, and they could spend 1% of $1 trillion. Remember, we're spending 4 at the moment.
That's the beginning. Not even the end of the beginning.
As Chris said. Yeah, I think you said there's another 1.5 coming, you think, Chris?
Oh, yeah, another 2.2 and another 1.6. It's going to be, my numbers are wrong, but they're close.
So, the amount that you need to launch a sensible program, anticipating, you can't anticipate all, because you'd never know what organism is going to mutate into something really awful or what new organism is going to come. But you sure can do a hell of a lot better. I will say just one more thing in this regard for your audience. This is preferentially, not uniquely, because I've had 2 of my family die this week of COVID.
Sorry to hear that, Frank.
Of COVID. One was 23 years old. And the point of all of this is that, in fact, we have the option of. Let me back up. There used to be a thing called the infectious disease listening posts around the world. I think I'm not. I better be careful to say which administration got rid of most of them, not all of them. But it was a mechanism whereby the public health groups around the world, and especially the CDC, could get wind of risk early and could, in fact, implement tools, at least in a sense of preparation, to try to deal with the potential risk long before it became a real problem. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, COVID, they had ample warning. And they at least could have got the diagnostic capabilities ready and in mothballs, ready to be rolled out. This was a classic failure of public health policymakers.
And it didn't all come out of the blue, Frank. This is
No, it
a
did not.
long process. I've often thought of just in the behavioral sciences how the knowledge is cyclical. It's not like the physical sciences in the world in which you work, where the knowledge is cumulative. It seems we have to relearn the lessons of our grandparents, our great grandparents, all over again for
Right.
ourselves.
That's
And
a very good.
a long period of not seeing these risks convinces us that they don't exist, or we put our guard down.
If you get cynical, Chris, and I know you're something of a philosopher here, this really looks like some sort of plot to cull the old people in the world. This is awful situation where one particular demographic, age demographic, is being disproportionately affected, plus, of course, the impact in terms of diversity in the population. And it's I've heard some nonsense. Well, that sounds ridiculous. Usually, you hear a lot of nonsense from politicians. But I heard some nonsense this week, which was so cynical that it's okay, effectively, to let old people die. They almost have a right to die to provide for the younger folk.
Wow.
But my God, can you imagine being in a nursing home where 50% of the population in the nursing home is infected, and then 50% of those die?
Or a nursing home that's completely abandoned,
Frank,
like what they found in Italy.
I would say I had that experience after Hurricane Katrina. I'm a New Orleans native, and the first sign of that same thing was resignation, that it was really the poor people who were disproportionately affected. And oh well, there wasn't a real attention to that. And here you're right. I think if children were dying, the whole response would be much more understanding and dramatic than.
Or if you calculated the number of 747s which would crash, if you had one 747 crashing with 350, 400 people, what, 50?
Yeah, you'd spend a lot more money to fix
Yeah,
things.
2,000 people a day dying on a 747 in America would get everyone's attention.
In a harsher way than we have it
Yeah.
now. Yeah. Frank, I'm curious, and this is a question I'd meant a lot for you too, Chris. This pandemic, I've been trying to think about once in 100-year occurrences, things we can't see or sense as well. First question for you, Frank, is when do you think the next pandemic will be here? We've been kind of asking this to a couple different people.
Well, I wish I were a soothsayer.
You can play one on this podcast. I mean, do you think it's under 20 years? Let me ask you. Let me start with an easy number over. Okay.
Yes.
Do you think it's under 10 years?
I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I'm watching H5N1 very carefully. I don't think so. I think it's somewhere between a decade and 2 decades. And if, in fact, we've learned anything, maybe we can find a way to interdict the situation.
Yeah, so it's actually Eric's belief, Eric Tan, who I work with at Zoic, It's Eric's belief that we'll see the next pandemic in about 15 years.
Mm.
Yeah, 10 to 20 years, 15 years is about right.
Very interesting. Chris, you're pretty good at history, and maybe one of the best read investors I've met in history. Did you think about a pandemic happening in your life anywhere?
I didn't take, um, I didn't imagine the threat to be like this. No, this is,
Did you imagine a pandemic in our lives that would affect America?
yeah, yeah. I had a real, it's fascinating in many ways, a real failure of imagination to grasp the all the consequences. And I think um, it's also remarkable to see the response, to Frank's point, to see what's being done in other areas that give us instruction on how to handle this, like what's happened in South Korea and Taiwan, of course, Germany. Um, and also, it makes it a glaring fact of what we're missing here at home, so in the US. But no, I didn't imagine this. The
Frank,
rapidity of it, the speed, the warp speed of it, I think, is really what caught me flat.
I completely, and that's due to the
Hmm.
inherent infectivity.
and
It's
did you
contagious.
think we'd see a
What?
pandemic in your life, Frank, as you were studying infectious diseases?
Oh, the answer is yes. There's a colleague of mine at Mayo who is quite well known in this country. His name is Greg Poland. He works a lot with the Department of Defense, but he's in the general population as well. And I remember Greg at Mayo has been talking about the risk of a pandemic. I think he was coming at it primarily from the standpoint of influenza. Um, but he talked about this. And it's scary how the playbook that he pictured for everybody is playing out. And it's also interesting, by the way, there's a book that was published, I think, about 2 years ago, where that playbook in that book, I don't remember the author, I heard it on public radio the other day, but I'm sure it will be easy to find, in which the playbook that author conjured is remarkably the playbook that's
Oh
playing
yes,
out right
there
now.
was actually I saw an interview on 60 Minutes with a guy who actually did a simulation in December for a lot of big countries to look at what a pandemic would look like, and obviously it hit China first, and the Chinese health minister was at that simulation. So he was saying how remarkably scary and accurate everything that he predicted happened.
Well, six years ago, I gave a CME lecture in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This was for the Mayo's CME program. And I gave it the following title: Infectious Agents Don't Need to Buy Plane Tickets.
They ride for free, Doc?
And it was the source of,
There's a cost, Chris. You're an economist. Don't forget that.
you know, it was the source of significant hilarity and people leaving the room. I would love to see the audience again. And what is scary about that is, maybe it was just me. Um, everybody thought it was a real absurdity, a joke.
Mm.
Interesting. Clearly not. What other once in 100-year occurrences, Chris and Frank? And I guess this is not a once in 100-year occurrence anymore. It just happened to have happened 101 years ago. What other ones do you think we're facing in both of, well, let's say all three of our lifetimes? I'm the youngest at 40 here.
Yeah,
Chris, you want to tackle that first?
well, we already have seen this pre-COVID. The rise of nationalism. There'll be more onshoring. I think this is it's a fascinating case study because nothing could affect all aspects of our lives like a pandemic could, like a virus, and the combination of its mortality and its infectiousness is amazing. And you couldn't devise a more diabolical weapon. So I think it exposes our weakness in the supply chain, So there'll be more onshoring. There'll be a furtherance, I think, of kind of more nationalist attitudes. I hope that
Wait,
doesn't.
you're going the wrong way. I'm not asking for conclusion about what happens after the pandemic. I'm
Yeah,
asking you about other once in 100-year occurrences.
I see.
I'm
Wow.
actually
But
asking
I
you to
think,
put your actuarial hat on if you were
but I
writing.
think, no, I think it could, the rise of nationalism and the furtherance of it could make countries a little more bellicose. I think we could have more flare-ups, more violence if we're not careful, if the more noble aspects of our humanity don't come out of this crisis. So,
I would agree with you. It's not just this crisis. I think generally, one of the things that I have been surprised by, even though I had thought that it was feasible or at least plausible, is how one individual can so distort the society that we see with tolerance attached armed people in a capital, as we did in Michigan, where they're carrying submachine guns openly, and I bet you they were loaded, with just essentially a whisper of disagreement with that stance, despite the minority. This cannot be classed as free speech. And what I'm surprised at in that case, and by the way, this is exactly what you're talking about, Chris, the rise of what I call subhumanity. I think that is a very real risk as right wingism seems to hold sway increasingly in the world, partly driven by the misguided attitude towards need, and partly written just out of sheer meanness. I agree with you. That is a social phenomenon that I find scary because the few can drive the behavior, not the behavior, but the response of many. And one individual has sufficient influence to have that be an impact all over the
it's
world.
true, Frank.
And largely because of the fact that our checks and balances, the people who are responsible for our checks and balances, namely the Congress, is so pusillanimous.
Well, I
It is
even think they
distressing.
take on the values of the one in power, right? It becomes both sides become better and better at marshaling hatred and division. It's almost like a breeder reactor. We have to shake ourselves out of it. I think and hope this fighting this in unified way, this enemy, like an alien invasion, would bring us together. But
Well, I think that, to be honest with you, I'm sufficiently cynical at this point. I think that's probably a forlorn hope. Uh, but just one quick thing that I keep forgetting to say, because it's a real pet peeve of mine regarding COVID or other infectious diseases, Neal, is that we use as our sole metric of severity or dominant metric, 95% to 5% dominant metric, mortality. And everybody seems to forget that there is a whole path to dying.
mm,
It's called morbidity. And the reality is, we need a morbidity index for people to fully understand the impact of this disease. Because a hell of a lot of people get really sick and they suffer, and the economy suffers, and everything suffers. The morbidity is way in excess of the mortality in terms of death. Even people who survive, they go through 20, 30, 40 days of recovery in a very expensive environment in the intensive care of hospitals. And they are sick. And the toll that takes on families must be enormous. So I'd love to see a morbidity index. And I'd love to see discussions. I don't hope for any empathy from Trump, but it would be nice to have the populace understand that it's not just dying, it's also being damned sick.
yeah,
Frank,
I think that's a fantastic suggestion.
Frank, I'm curious, and Chris, weigh in everywhere you can, please. When do you think? So my wife works at Microsoft. when do you think she'll be back at work normally? And I've heard different answers and rumors from within her company, and um, all over the place. I live in Seattle, what was ground zero for the United States. When will all the Amazonians be back? When will all the people at Boeing be back? When does that happen again?
That's a complex. I keep telling people that questions are invariably simple. There are not very few complex questions. It's the answers that are complex. And this is a good
I figured,
example.
yeah.
Simple question, yes. Simple question, hard to answer because the variables are so broad and so dependent on independent company attitudes, the size of the company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The
Hold on,
small companies
hold on. I would
in
say
this
we could
country
all
which
agree it's
thrive.
over 5 years. Sorry, it's under 5 years that they'll be back to work. But the fact that I'm even saying years is strange to
Well,
me.
it depends. I don't think so. I personally believe that a vaccine will come along. And if I could, if I had my wherewithal, I'd give you some advertisement of that. I personally believe that a vaccine will come. Coronaviruses are hard to build vaccines to, but our knowledge and sophistication, I personally believe that Steve Reed is one of the best vaccine hunters in the world. And if he and Derek Carter were loose to really work on vaccines, a variety of vaccines, that he could do it. And I know a vaccine candidate that I have great faith in. I'm trying to raise funds for. I think a vaccine will come along. If a vaccine doesn't come along, we're in deep tapioca anyway. Very deep tapioca for a very long time. We need a vaccine.
And
Is there any evidence, Frank, of immunity? You have evidence of antibodies.
No,
Mhm.
it's going to take a while, Chris. You need more people who will have had either a vaccine or have had the disease and recovered. And we prove that they have what are called not just antibodies, but neutralizing antibodies. Um, and if so, you can be more and more confident that you don't have to just take it as presumptive evidence that they're immune, at least in the short term. We don't know about long-term immunity. That'll take time. Um, but if they I think we need to get to about 60 to 70% is the figure that I've heard quoted repeatedly by my epidemiology friends. And if we can get to that number, then in fact we will be protected at least against SARS-CoV-2. What the heck happens if new ones come
Or
along?
when?
I don't know. I hope there's enough cross-reactivity. So, Neal, I think not 5 years. I really do believe that there will be a vaccine, but remember the challenges associated with trying to vaccinate such huge numbers of people, both in terms of manufacture,
worldwide,
distribution, and
yeah.
administration worldwide. Because if you leave pockets anywhere and they can migrate, you got a problem.
Yeah.
This so-called herd
So
immunity is very important.
it sounds to me like you think over a year. We'll give you an over versus an under till everybody's back to work normally.
I think it's probably going to be longer than that because just the sheer numbers involved, even with a good vaccine. Just think of the army of people you're going to need to administer the vaccine, depending on the route and depending on how long the vaccine's effect lasts. We simply don't know. And we need all these things to be investigated thoroughly so we have a better idea. Either that or the cynicism of the society as a whole and letting the old people be culled takes over. Um, Realistically, it's going to take the length of time is determined by, first of all, generating an effective vaccine, and secondly, manufacturing and distributing it, and thirdly, then testing to see if it's efficacious in the wide population wide. This will be
It's a
with us
long road.
for a long time.
And the follow-on questions, Neal, of course, can't be answered. Like, what are those changes in people's behavior? How soon will people get back to stadiums and basketball arenas or concerts or opera?
Those were kind of dying down. Concerts maybe were there, but sports were dying down anyway. So people are going to be happy to watch it on TV. I think. I don't think too much about that. I do wonder when the three of us
Okay.
think about our next vacation. When's the next time we should all be thinking about going to Jamaica and enjoying the beach? Next
Next week.
Right away. Yeah.
I really don't know, Neal. Yes, my whole family I wanted to take, because this may be one of the few times in the rest of my life I'll be able to take my whole family. We've just put it off indefinitely. I don't know. I think it's going to take a little bit of, sort of physical hubris to challenge the COVID virus. In my case, I'm hoping I'm immune, and I hope there'll be a vaccine for my children. But I don't know.
Chris, do you worry about the maybe the greatest crash of all time happening at the same time while all of these things are being drastically affected? Is that something that's in your calculus on a daily basis?
Yes. Which business models even will survive this in how we change? I mean, who's buying an iPhone now, right? I put that to the audience. Maybe they can answer. I don't know. What will people value coming out of the other side of this? It certainly will change the way we consume in ways that are going to have varying impacts on this. I don't know how many restaurants will come back. Small business is 87% of our employment in this country.
Well, my heart goes out to that sushi restaurant we go to near your office.
Yeah, they have takeout, but I'm adventurous, but not that adventurous. Yeah.
Well, I'm adventurous. After this, I'm going to go to a sushi restaurant and get takeout.
Well, I mean, a story for another day. You're also the one who went running with the bulls, so I never put anything past you, Frank.
That is a classic example of stupidity.
See, even for a moment, you could relate with the present administration.
No, I can't. There is stupidity. There is stupidity, and there is stupidity. In one case, it's asininity.
Yeah, Frank, I've have my own version of Schadenfreude, right? I wish we had a scientist like Angela Merkel is, to at least know the limits of her knowledge, and also to understand and believe in science.
Well, I have a new definition of nadir.
You thought we couldn't go lower.
That's right. Oh God. Well, I love this notion of Schadenfreude. I'm sort of keep on hoping that maybe somebody will take one of these news conferences and
Chris, what other questions do you have for Frank? I mean, we have this brilliant mind on the phone to be asking. What kind of things are you wondering about that there's not good information about that would actually affect your trading next week?
Oh my God,
that Frank can answer. Sorry, he's not as he told us, he's not a soothsayer.
Not only that, I'm not an oracle.
Thanks for clearing that up, Frank. I mean, are there any other questions you think would actually affect how you trade?
No, Neal, the trading versus looking for the longer term opportunities. I really am trying to think 18 months to 2 years out.
Well, it sounds like you should be thinking longer than that.
Yeah.
Even by the questions you're asking me.
That is ultimately, for a business cycle is where I'm thinking, at least. But we just don't know. We're really all flying in the fog of war. And I guess it's a question of, when, other than having a vaccine, when this can be tamed sufficiently so that there is some return of the supply chain and back to work for many people, and how that can happen. But more importantly, it's a question of life and death. We appear to be flattening the curve, but I think many of the deaths are undercounted. So there's some corruption in the data. I don't know when we really think we'll start to see a better result, a real flattening of the curve. I guess. If we can really see a flattening of the curve, then I think people will feel a sense of great relief and catharsis.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about from my perspective, and Frank, please weigh in on everything for the rest of the time you're with us. Should you feel the desire to, or even just throw rocks at our ideas, that's okay as well here. It's interesting as I look at VC investment, I think more and more about this idea of making sure there's an option to invest later when things are more stabilized. So it's not a question of just investing now to build or to innovate on things that will actually affect people's health. It's about, because it's so hard to understand what the value is of something today. And most of the investments you're making anyway, or that I'm making anyway, are really a bet on an option of the future, right? Because most of these companies couldn't sell for exactly what I was buying for today. So
Yeah.
if I'm taking an option on the future, I want, an extra leveraged option with the idea that things are more calm worldwide.
Yes. So you want, of course, it's got to be an asymmetrical bet
Right.
in
It's got
your mind.
It's got to be an asymmetrical bet with with both options, with two options on it, right? The first one to initiate, and the second one to make up anything I would have missed, or to make up for the extra value of being able to do something now.
Neal, I mean, you're asking real world questions that affect me every single day, both in terms of my thinking and in terms of my actions. I find myself becoming more and more parsimonious with myself, wanting to be more and more conservative, take less risk, but especially focus a great deal on value, and that value is being redefined by what has happened with COVID. There will always be need, and therefore there will always be a need for creative entrepreneurship where it makes people's lives better. But this is not like a war, which in many ways is binary. The war is there, it's over. You recover from the war as best you can. There's a sort of lingering effect that worries me a great deal. A lingering uncertainty and insecurity that is going to
I think
linger
probably for the rest
for
of my
a
life,
long time.
there'll be a little bit of a lingering.
Although very, very possible, but with especially at the moment, and God knows I hope it changes in November, with a jingoistic administration, you're going to be constantly worried about the impact of a stupid decision. And the fact that you compound what is already a terrible problem in the form of disease with a terrible action on the part of an idiot. And that is, in many ways, that's more fearsome and more worrisome than even COVID. I really do believe in the power of science to solve problems and even to predict them and prevent them. I don't know how you deal with the absurdities of idiocy. And that's what really worries me. It's just like Chris said with the whole rise of right wing behavior. In one sense, it's predictable. It's also controllable because the numbers still are small. But how big is the influence really? So the sort of accumulation of all these uncertainties creates an ongoing insecurity, which I think has to affect the market. I was rereading Kahneman's book on think fast and slow, think slow and fast,
We'll
or
put it in
what?
the
Yeah,
show notes
think
again.
slow, think fast. Yeah. So, and realizing the whole issue of behavioral factors in determining economies, I had always thought that, but never could articulate it. So just everything is going to change. And so there's no normality anymore against which you can buttress your future thoughts, your thoughts of the future. And the uncertainty that all creates, I think, is going to be a drag on the market for a long time. Now, having said that, I was asked yesterday by a most unusual entrepreneur in the real estate business to serve as an advisor for him. And I'm going to do it. And I'm wondering, what in the hell am I going to say?
Yeah, it's a strange time for sure to be doing stuff related to real estate.
So, now that we've solved the problem of the world,
we appreciate your time today with us, Frank.
Well, this has been a wonderful soapbox for me. I hope I've said
No, we
something
appreciate
interesting.
your insights, Frank.
Yeah, I appreciate your heart, especially. Thank you, Frank, for joining us. It's been great.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
We
I'll come
will
back
invite you in
anytime
the
you
next
invite
couple
me.
months. I think it even more important what it takes to run a world-class organization, a world-class research organization. And I'm kind of curious, the things you learned and the things you would change as a result of the things you saw and are seeing, because obviously all of the researchers doing anything related to a virus or anything related to we'll call it healthcare are going to matter even more.
Yeah, that actually, yes, that would be a lot of fun, Neal. And just to tell Chris, you see, one of the things he is indirectly referring to, Chris, is that not only was I on the board of governors and board of trustees at Mayo Clinic, but as also for a while director of the research
Oh,
program at Mayo in Rochester. And that is a very big research organization, not as big as some, but bigger than the vast majority. And you have to know something about Mayo as well, because it's a unique organization in terms of how it's structured and functions. And even defining how you run things there is an interesting experience. I was also director of the Cancer Center there for 12 years. I'm not an oncologist, but we did have substantial success during that period of time, and it's worthwhile examining for the public why. Why were we successful? In part because I was not an oncologist. Therefore, you escape the stereotypy, but mostly because you empowered people to be themselves and to give of their best. That is really, it's humbling, but to the extent you can evoke that sentiment, it's amazing what you can accomplish. And that's one of the things that gives me hope going forward, as long as we get leadership. Right now, we're sadly devoid
Frank,
as a
was it
country of
an
leadership.
intentional process within Mayo to put, say, a non-oncologist in charge of the cancer center and cross-pollinate intellectually in that way?
No, it was totally serendipitous. You know, I had no plans to do that. I had been director for research for the whole enterprise before, and there was just a need, and they said you're the person to fulfill that need, without any good reason for saying that.
Well, there was a good reason, just not the reason of oncology.
I said they were nuts, is what I say.
Well, thank you again.
Thanks for your
Frank.
time today, Frank. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Really nice meeting you, Chris. We need to do this in a different forum.
And I hope in person one day.
Over some beautiful Jamaican rum.
Yes.
I'll make you the best rum punch and daiquiri you ever had, and I'll even imbibe with you.
All right, Frank, we're going to hold you to that. Thanks, Frank. Wow, that a lot to think about, huh, Chris?
I was, at sea with my thoughts. He's fantastic.
He's so clear about how he thinks about the world.
Well, I think this is probably when he said, I have a new definition of nadir. I think that is, we all do. Um, you think we've gone low enough, and then it just, this becomes a parody of itself. Um, if we look back, and people don't like to make comparisons historically, especially because it's difficult this time. But whether it's Marie Antoinette or or the 1930s, and Mussolini and the sort of macho but cartoonish leaders, you wonder how it could have happened then. It's happening now, right? And it's not just here. It's almost like at times a wave or a storm hits humanity, and we have to endure this corruption of leadership, of just bad leadership on all sides, right?
Yeah, everywhere we go. Yeah, it's for sure.
But the optimistic side of me is that Frank was cynically dismissing, is when we're tested enough, we humans have survived. We've always bounced back. It's just a question of how bad does it have to get before we really stand our ground. And when would people, what's that old saying? When you would rather die than subject yourself to a tyranny, even a small one, then tyranny can't advance, right? You check it. I don't know if people would rather die. Yet they give me liberty or give me death idea.
Yeah, John Henry.
Yeah, that was John Henry, of course. But the our country's been pretty remarkable. I mean, we've had some bad presidents before, um, right? Chester Arthur probably was not so well remembered. Martin Van Buren, strangely, all of them were mixed. But this is a real challenge, a real challenge to especially a scientist, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's certainly interesting. I'm kind of curious about a few things in current events that maybe we can cover before we move on from the podcast, if you've got the time.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how the oil price is going to continue to affect the world. I mean, like, you've got just a cataclysm of things just keep hitting the world again and again, and oil being one of them now. The price of oil. What? Talk, please.
Yeah.
Enlighten. Share some information.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating time. There's an argument to be made that all of the markets are heavily manipulated. I mean that in the truest sense of the word. I'm not trying to use it in a loaded sense or an judgmental sense, but the markets are being manipulated. The Japanese are buying directly in ETFs, form bonds and stock funds. The Swiss National Bank was one of the biggest owners of Apple stock. You see it all over. So these asset prices are propped up, but at the same time, you see markets like oil, and they're like a Rorschach of our very psyche. The oil price crashes because of a supply. Well, first the demand destruction from COVID, and then the people who are the biggest producers, Russia and Saudi Arabia, which had an uncomfortable relationship, decide to have a fight. They're in denial. There's a price war that breaks out. So then you have a supply shock loaded on top of a demand shock. The oil price goes all the way negative. It's really unbelievable. So to negative interest rates, which we have never seen in 5,000 years of interest rate history, we can now add negative oil prices.
Which I would have never bet when you and I met, near 10 years ago now.
We can add the sharpest, fastest decline ever in the stock market's history. A 35% decline's never happened that quickly. And also the fastest recovery of 22% or so from that bottom. But the profile of a bear market has historically always been a sharp sell-off followed by a reflexive rebound and then a long, drawn-out fundamental decline. So that's the profile. That's Bob Farrell, the great Merrill Lynch analyst and market seer and historian. had 10 rules of investing. That's his rule number 8, the profile of the bear market. But it's been that way. So we're definitely in that reflexive rebound phase. And those often are a retracement of between 50 and 50, half to 2/3, 50 to 66% retracement. And we're right up there, 57, 58% before the market started giving it back up. I'm not thinking technically, but just looking at the history of how these things have played out.
So I I appreciate that. I guess you're also saying you're waiting and watching. So you just a little while ago, just to show how bad we are at predictions, you were excited about some oil companies in I think the Netherlands, right?
Yes. Oh, Neal, I was excited about energy in the fourth quarter of last year because the oil prices were just, I think, recovering. They're still low historically, and it's certainly on an inflation.
They're even lower now.
The whole energy segment of the S&P 500 index was the smallest it had ever been, but it was 4.3%. Now it's about 1.2 or something percent of the index. It's shrunken more. So I thought of the energy space is very cheap in the fourth quarter on a relative basis, certainly, but even on an absolute basis. And now it's just unbelievable how this is all played out.
Wait, so what kind of business? What kind of venture capital makes sense to me because we're working on things that take a while, and they're still needed in the stuff we're looking at anyway. Is still needed in healthcare in a major way, right? Major cost savings, major time savings, much better diagnostics. When you're looking at the public markets, can you give me even one notable example to you about?
Well, you've got to superimpose that Rorschach test that the markets are. In the short term, there's a tremendous element of the human psyche, the fear and greed.
Right, which you said once.
Is imposed on the prices. It's an auction market. You're not necessarily in a daily auction with your company,
right?
Where people can assess the value of the whole entire enterprise to have fallen by half. You're like, how did that happen in a month? The company, but in this environment, our fear is really stamped on this market. I think even in this sort of bear market bounce is what I anticipate most likely this is. It's certainly not the beginning of a bull market. We've only begun to see the earnings impact of COVID, just the tip of the first quarter.
Wait, so is there any sector you're liking even a little bit that you might? I mean, other than gold?
I like a lot of sectors, but it's with the caveat that I don't know how long they'll take to get up off the mat.
Yes, but when you invest, you give yourself. You're not. Even though I talk about what you're trading next week, you're really investing for 5-10 years. Even though you're talking about 2-year ideas. Yeah. So when you're thinking about 5 years out, what's a sector that you're at least enjoying looking at today?
I think most transportation, especially shipping, is very, very inexpensive. That's
been a theme of yours for a while now.
Well, those companies went through a bear market. There was an overbuilding of ships. The South Korean companies were very enterprising and very efficient, but it led to an oversupply, and then we went into the great financial crisis. Most of the shipping, especially dry bulk carriers, even many of the container ships, went through bankruptcy. Many of the shipbuilders reorged, and the supply of ships hasn't met the demand growth. The bottom of that market in daily lease rates was around 2015, 2016, depending on what segment of the market you look at. But shipping globally is still the backbone of commerce. And to see those companies, their revenues recover from that 2016 nadir, and the stock market didn't even recognize it, those are wonderful opportunities. But of course, just like with oil and energy, the global commerce is impacted, and those things that were already inexpensive in the fourth quarter got cheaper. You can say that about many assets, except for tech. I think in the public markets, they were that were inexpensive in the fourth quarter and got cheaper with this sell-off and just the panic that many stock market investors had.
So one of the trends I've seen for a number of years, I think of Apple more as a healthcare company. I see when you mention tech, I also think that more and more tech companies are going to be moving into healthcare and med tech. And I think,
in what sense, Neal? Do you think that the tracking of
yes,
COVID patients and
not
that will kind of jumpstart that initiative?
that's good. I have a hard time seeing through that. It's kind of opaque to me. But let me just try and tell you why I think Apple is a bit of a healthcare company. They put an ECG on everybody's hand, right? And everybody who buys, everybody who's giving the metadata from their iPhone back to Apple is providing real information on their health, whether that's walking, whether you have the walking app installed or not. They know where you are.
Won't they just sell that though? Another stream of income?
But to who? Who's that worth to? So I think these guys are going to start investing in more and more healthcare companies. A good buddy of mine once worked for Apple, and he'd worked on some acquisitions there, and he'd said, look, if you can add a big database and a credit card to it, Apple's probably interested in taking a look at it. So I think that you're going to see more products like that are as ubiquitous as the pedometer today come out from the Apples of the world. How's that in the tech world?
I hear you. Well, I don't know, man. I think what is that great quote from Virgil that's in the beginning of securities analysis? Many shall rise that are now fallen, and many shall fall that are now in honor. I think Google and Facebook are basically advertising-based companies, and I think advertising in a recession is always the first thing to get cut. So we'll see how they respond.
But they don't die either way. They're still kind of too big to fail.
I agree. It's possible, and they also can operate with more flexible costs, say, than the old line advertisers like Ogilvy or something with Chicago.
Yeah. If Google cuts 70% of its headcount tomorrow, it's I don't even know what it does. If Google's revenue gets cut by 70%, they don't need to cut much of their headcount, right? They're still really profitable.
Yes, but there would be reverberations and shocks. Of course, the share price become the bellwether for everyone in terms of corporate health, financial health, economic health. But the stock market really doesn't have a bearing on the real economy. COVID does, but the stock market is now going to be wagged by the dog. It's going to be the tail wagged by the real economy dog, I think. Not just the playground for the Fed and for traders.
Interesting. I've got rather than doing so, that was kind of our current events section. I've got a couple thoughts on the VC corner here for us. I'd seen a big trend. That's not a big trend. I'd seen a small trend that I think was going to become bigger, to use algorithms to spot winners in venture capital. How good is that going to continue to be in your, like, when I say those words to you, what is it you're thinking?
I think it's a new I don't know how that gives you a lasting advantage. Neal? I think in our world of investing, no matter what side of the coin you're on, you have to, the difference is behavioral, right? It's behavioral. It's how do you assess the quality of a company and its leadership, and how do you allocate capital appropriately? How to your best idea should go your most of your capital. I don't know how algorithms. I think it'll ultimately be another form of a crowded trade. Basically, they're going to start selling those off-the-shelf algorithms, or they're going to be written similarly because we human beings tend to be group animals. We tend to think similarly. I don't know. I just think
that's what my thought about it is. Like, I think you can use
another way that the low-hanging fruit gets arbitraged out more quickly.
The only thing I think of algorithms for, and we used one from a company recently, we helped build one from a company recently, very small costs, and it helped identify a bunch more companies for us. So it was mostly for us to just test it out. I think it's
like a screening tool.
Yeah, that's right. More how I thought about it, right? Like if you give me 10 other good quality companies to look at, great. I'm all about your algorithm. But I'm still going to look at them. I'm still going to dig into the. I think there's no replacement for fundamental analysis, even another 50 years from now, right? Just you've got to be able to think for yourself and do the hard research.
No, and you're always, always, always in business with people.
Yeah.
Not with numbers. It's funny. Whenever I think of science and I talk to people with the mind of Frank, and I was a chemistry major and economics major, and the difference between the two, the quality of the data in the behavioral sciences and economics was just so poor. No margins for error, no reliable data was usually collected in different ways. Again, just a strange jump. Yet, economic numbers get reported again without margins for error, and they're digested fully by the market, and it swings prices. GDP numbers, which are billions of calculations, not with a margin for error. They do at least try to correct it. You get 5 goes at the GDP number. They can adjust it, and they do. But still, it's fascinating to me.
Yes, it's very interesting. The other thing I wonder about in kind of the last couple of thoughts on VC is what themes are going to be dying out and which ones are worth more and worth spending more time on. For instance, we actually think it's worth spending a lot more time on women's health because it's been neglected for a very long time, and obviously they're consumers just like everybody else, and they need things that the world hasn't given them yet. That's a theme that I think will grow, even if it's neglected. Is there any themes that right away die in your mind or start to die, other than, I don't know?
I think healthcare generally, Neal, you're in a sense in the sweet spot from this tremendous brain power and human power being put to COVID to wake us up. Hopefully we stay woke in this, but I think mental health too. You're probably right with the women's health side of things getting attention, but I think I hope we come back to a stronger focus on mental health in this country. Remember, we talked to Gary last week, and it was fascinating how he said, how many people incarcerated with him in Angola were suffered from mental health problems.
Yeah, which kind of just tells me they shouldn't be there. Right? It'd be great to find ways to treat them. I'm with you.
Misdirected.
Yeah.
Yeah, misdirected people, and that they need that. I'm sure we all need it in society, but within the prison certainly, and that more than 2/3 of them were illiterate or functionally illiterate. It's amazing.
The last kind of interesting commentary on the kind of the VC section here for me, and then I'd love to just hear your message to the folks the 120 families that you care about the most.
I care about more families.
No, but those are the 120 families that you're thinking about daily. They matter a lot. Like I've heard you use the number a number of times. You care deeply about making sure those people are happy and are prepared. I'm realizing a lot, and I don't know that I could have described this when I first met you or when I was running a superconductor company, that good venture capitalists are a lot like good value investors. That's more and more my impression, because both seem to be after a very long game, and I don't tend to see that in lots of other places. Although there's variations, right? There's value investors who were saying Apple was a good value stock just last year, right? As you were telling me at some value conference you went to. which is kind of funny.
Yeah, again, different investors will place higher or different weightings on other variables or things they believe will happen. It does take some imagination. Those who bet on Apple a year ago were right, at least in terms of they're vindicated in terms of current price.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's a value stock. My only point is that venture capital, at least healthcare venture capital, let me change that, is a lot more like
Mhm.
value investment than I realized. Um,
Oh, I think it always is. It's funny because Neil, when you talk about algorithms, first my point before was most of them are built on financial and economic data, which is a poor quality data set, generally
right.
speaking. I see it in the public markets. They've built algorithms, and some of them are good in a way. They've ferreted out some of and sort of squeezed out some of the old simple ways some value investors would work, like looking at the balance sheet, low price to book value and those kinds of sort of simple equations. History had shown for 70 years that if you buy stocks that have a low price to book value, or the bottom quintile of those stocks, you would outperform the general market. Well, that stopped working when the algorithms all crowded in and there were, the money flowed into there and boosted the value. It's just one of those things in the behavioral world that when everyone's doing it, it stops working. And ultimately, that crowd will gather even with an algorithm. I don't know what data sets they'll use in your world, but I know in my world, the data sets they use are
Oh,
not
they're going to be
of the highest.
terrible. Let me just say. That's why I think the fundamental analysis is needed, right? You've got to understand as much as you can from the papers, from the patents. You've got to
Uh-huh.
take a good understanding of the people. You've got to understand, why bigger companies are acquiring or not acquiring that space, or trying to take actual understanding of where Medtronic's going to shift to in a few years. And it's not like I have the answers to every one of those questions really well. It's that I spend lots of time trying to understand those things and just a framework.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think some ways your work is harder than mine, or at least has a different level of complexity because you're looking for the Lee Kuan Yews,
No,
the nation
Lake Queen.
builders.
Oh, okay. Nation builders.
He built Singapore up,
Okay.
right?
Thank you.
Something very few people like this, a new city state, akin to Venice or something. Um, and he was surrounded by enemies, and he did it. And it's a very high functioning society. Um, you're looking for people who can build like that. I'm kind of looking more at things that are already built, um, or that you can see the structure has already manifested, and the people running it, and you can assess how they've done. You can look at that a little bit too, right? Their track records, what they've done,
Yeah.
uh, records of success, how they treat the people with them. Do they have an enthusiastic team? All that really matters. Um, so,
Take me through your thoughts. What do you like? It's Friday afternoon, May 1st, and your last client calls and says, "Hey, Chris, I'm just so scared," or "Hey, Chris, just share how it went for us in the market this week. You share what it is you're thinking. What is it you're saying to these families?"
well, I think we have many layers in the portfolio. Um, there's, there's reserves of cash. We don't usually have them full. We have short-term bonds. We've been lucky. We've had an allocation to long-term treasury bonds, and rates have plummeted. We believe there's a deflationary event followed by inflation. That the response of the central banks is confirmed and made us more constructive on once we get through this deflationary demand destruction of COVID, we'll come out on the other side because of monetary policy and direct payments to consumers will come out with some inflationary pressure on the other side. So we've had right now treasuries and interest rates have fallen and that boosts the bond prices. So that's helped. We've had an allocation to precious metals, which has also been um, very
You've been
helpful.
bullish on precious metals as long as I've known you.
Yeah, I have, and I've been wrong through some of that
Of
period.
course. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, because
But you're still investing
you
for
know,
a long period. You're not investing for a short period. So yes, you've been wrong at moments.
yeah. Well, the challenge always with any commodity investing, whether it's oil and energy or gold or whatever, is always the price of the commodity itself. And I'd envisioned the dramatic response, Herculean response of the central banks to the great financial crisis, the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet. I thought all of that would result in some inflation, and it was not to be had. The money mostly that the Fed gave to banks in form of reserves stayed in bank reserves. It was like a stagnant pool. It didn't circulate in the economy and create any inflationary pressure. But this is different. The direct payments to consumers makes a difference. It's not just a bailout that gets trapped within the financial system. It's going into the real economy. So I think that's really lit a fire under the precious metals price at long last. Though, Neal, remember, precious metals will thrive on any kind of monetary instability, usually. Whether it's deflationary pressure or inflationary pressure, people usually cling to the oldest form of money. It's no one else's liability. It just has that feature of safety and simplicity. So it's not hard to understand. And people go for safety and simplicity and not complexity in a situation like this. So that's all.
Are there any other things you would say to them?
Yeah, that they have the tools to make it through to the other side, but we're watching it daily. I do think this is a bear market, and I do think that it will have that historic profile of this sharp rebound giving way to a longer and more durable decline. So we want to keep reserves because there are better prices that we're probably going to see in the future. But there's that old saying, you can't pick the bottom. There's no timing. The bottom is the day before the market starts to rise and doesn't look back. And no one can pick the bottom. So, there will be compelling investments and we should pick them. We should invest in them when they come along. We shouldn't ask ourselves, is this the bottom? No one can say you should spend all your money or invest it all today, but equally, no one can say you shouldn't think ahead. And when you see a compelling investment, invest some today. So it's not a question of being scared. It's just being thoughtful and being patient, but being prudent. That's really the way forward.
Chris, I appreciate the time with you as normal, even though we get to do this together and I get lots of interaction with you. I'm always grateful to spend this time with you to record this podcast and really learn from your wisdom.
Well, thank you, Neal. I'm glad to be on it. I'm glad to have this audience and have people who care about not just investing, but philosophically being aligned with their choices and their values. Value is always subjective. So people will, like you were saying in the old example of Apple, some people will value it as they will call it a value stock. But again, it's all subjective. I like pears more than apples anyway.
Thanks for joining us today on Market Meditations.
That is all for today's episode of Market Meditation. We would like to thank Franklyn Prendergast for taking the time to be featured on today's podcast. If you would like to learn more about either of our hosts, please feel free to visit zoiccapital.com or hbawealth.com. If you have any questions for our hosts, please feel free to reach out via LinkedIn. Thank you for listening.
We're going to actually have this episode edited by one of Tanner's good buddies this time. So not Chad this time, just to play around with it. He's going to produce it a lot more, add some sound effects and that kind of stuff.
Ah.
So we'll see what it sounds like.
Sound effects, we're going to get like what, explosions?
Yeah. So funny enough, Callahan used to build bombs in the Navy for a living. So you might get sounds of explosions if you ask him. Thanks in advance, Callahan.
Yeah, thank you.
Tanner, you're a stud and a scholar.
Appreciate it. Thank you. it's kind of nerve-wracking a little bit, right? Because this is the first time SpaceX is going to have live people in it.
Let's hope they stay that way. Yeah.
Isn't SpaceX run by a robot?
A robot.
An AI robot programmed to confuse us all?
Yeah, maybe.
Oh yeah, there are going to be waves of this. Just as with the virus, there will be waves of panic, and some dislocations. I think, man, if China really devalues the renminbi, that would be a shock to the system. They do have that weapon.
Christopher, what was the most exciting part of your day so far?
Today,
Yeah.
coming into my office to be breaking out of my lockdown. Like I have some freedom.
You rebel, you.
Yeah.
If you want anything cut out at any point, just say, strike that. It'll be stricken.
No, I don't have anything political to say today.
No, it's totally okay if you want to talk about Trump to start with.
Oh, good God. No. I'm in a good mood. I want to stay in a good mood.